Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution we know we need. If you've been listening to the show for a while, you'll know I am no fan of the NDP. This hasn't always been the case. My position on and in the party shifted over time. But eventually I arrived at a place of complete contempt for the so-called Workers' Party. The stories you'll hear in this episode help explain that. And if anything, this last year has only solidified my position and left me more dismayed, but wholly validated for where I'm at, thinking the NDP actively contributes to the erosion of the political left in Canada. Their centrist policies are shifting the spectrum, but they also have this suppressing, moderating effect on those who know the way forward isn't with the systems oppressing us. A good majority of the members of the NDP would agree that capitalism is the problem, but the energy spent inside isn't engaging in anti-capitalist efforts. Instead, it's in ways where it can be maintained. The members knew before October 2023 that the occupation of Palestine was illegal and needed to be stopped. But all of that energy spent trying to get the party leaders to hold that line have produced next to nothing when it counts. Any sacrifices to be made to stop the genocide still rests on the grassroots members and massive mobilizations done without any assistance from the NDP. In fact, any elected officials or candidates who have dared push them on this have been sidelined and publicly attacked. Ontario MPP Sarah Jam is likely the most notable here, but she is by far from the only one. Our next guest, Sean McGilvery, will give you even more examples just from Nova Scotia. Not just candidates being removed for their support of Palestine, but of the countless ways in which the NDP has sold out its base, with few repercussions. This isn't to say that people haven't kicked up a storm or there hasn't been any bad press, but certainly not enough to elicit any genuine reflection or changes from leadership. Nova Scotia NDP is right now celebrating a 3-seat gain, but their new position of official opposition isn't due to any vote gains from their last election in 2021. The Liberal Party there, as it has in other provinces, collapsed, and the NDP couldn't secure any of that. The Conservatives have an even steeper majority now, and I can guarantee the people over there are not looking back and reflecting on the minor blip in the news that became of the removal of Eastern Passage candidate Tammy Jackman. I won't say more on that now because Sean will walk us through it, but before we get into the interview, I want to speak to the NDP members still in the party. Still paying dues, still volunteering, maybe going door to door. What is your threshold? This is especially for folks angry, sending angry emails, demanding backdoor meetings with their connections, attempting to hold the party accountable. Where is all that courage your Jack Layton spoke of? I can tell you from firsthand experience that the party has been purging our comrades for decades, and to a very particular end. The NDP now do nothing but serve to de-radicalize us, water us down, keep us cycling through the mechanisms provided to us by the ruling class. For all I know, this was always their purpose. Discouraging third ways and marginalizing the most radical amongst the Canadian political left. Traditionally socialists, but certainly not limited to. Now, we use the poem, First They Came for the Socialists, to explain what solidarity is. The importance of not waiting until it happens to you. But when it comes to righting wrongs within the party, most people just look away. You'll hear Sean did for a long time. Thousands of members are out there thinking they are being pragmatic by working the system, biding their time, building social and political capital, mostly just not knowing what else to do to secure better representation, better governance. And the result has been a completely unaccountable leadership who operate in much the same way the Democrats do, leaning on the fear folks have of the alternatives and looking past their base towards the right. For a moment, I'd like you to imagine what we could have done with all that time and energy, all those donations, if the NDP had been committed to being an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist party, one determined to deliver Indigenous sovereignty. We'll never know the impact of so many generations thinking the party was the only hope to obtain or even influence power. How many saw this as the only legitimate entry point to politics? We'll never know where we could have been if the people provided with such a platform had been as courageous as the people fighting for a free Palestine right now. So this episode, and really this entire podcast, is about not just proving these institutions weren't built for us. We feel that. We want to provide alternative ways in which we can affect change, even inside the legislature, without legitimizing one of the players benefiting from that system, who has no interest in doing the hard work. But it seems to continue to be this canon event, an experience one has to go through personally to appreciate it. I just wish it wasn't that way. I wish the playlist we've compiled that has scores of testimonies from the inception of the party to its current form, I wish that was enough. And the other warnings people have provided were enough to spur people out of that institution and into something new. But I don't think we're there yet. This is the same with all the stories of struggle we've shared and examples of revolutions we learn about. The goal is to get our people to the point of resistance before they have to experience the oppression so personally and devastatingly, while they still have the energy to fight. So for now, let Sean, and by proxy, Tammy's experience, get the air it deserves so folks can know exactly what they're putting their hope, love, and courage into. Welcome, Sean. Can you introduce yourself to the Blueprints audience?
Hi, my name's Sean McGilvery. Up until very recently, I was a dedicated New Democrat of 7 years, working on activities both in my local EDA and with the Central Party, including doing audio for events, making large signs, even doing a little bit of oppo. And now I, as a result of some recent events, am no longer a member of the party. I'm also a volunteer with some other organizations like Abortion Support Services Atlantic and the sort of local Palestine movement in Halifax. Such as it is, I provide audio for most of their demonstrations and some other demonstrations too, including those with the Indigenous community.
I think a lot of ears perked up right away when you said you were formally a member of the NDP. Let that foreshadow what this episode is going to be about. Let's first share the event you just alluded to. My audience may or may not know why I am no longer in the NDP. I'm sure that will come up today. That's a teaser. But why are you no longer in the party?
So I, as I mentioned, have been pretty close to the cause of Palestinian liberation, I think as a lot of people in the party and without the party have also been doing. I have been involved, like I said, for about the last year in regular demonstrations to that effect. And was also pretty dedicated to working with the NDP and sort of not, I don't think out of a sense of total naivety or necessarily even believing in the system. I feel like I tried to go about it from a very pragmatic approach, and I feel like even my departure had its pragmatic aspects. But all of which is to say, a candidate named Tammy Jakeman, who is someone I had worked with for quite a long time. I was her riding association president in Eastern Passage for 5 years, and I've been through an election with her, and you get all the trauma bonding that goes with working on an election together.
I didn't know you were in Eastern Passage as well. That's personal.
I moved to Cole Harbour actually in between the back-to-back provincial and federal elections in 2021. But I had worked with Tammy for most of my most formative years with the NDP. I got involved first in Eastern Passage. I had just moved out there, and I was looking to get involved. I was even considering running myself because I didn't know what the level of activity was out there. And so I started going to NDP events and pestering people and trying to find out how to get involved. And eventually I ended up going to this candidate nomination meeting, which was already an acclaimed nomination, and got involved with that candidate's campaign, and from there remained active with the party in Eastern Passage as its riding association president, as so frequently happens once you get involved.
I'm trying to count on my hands like how many people, I don't have that many fingers, have given that entry point. You know, it's not to say that your story isn't special. I'm sorry, Sean, but yeah, it's just that is very reminiscent of most people's experience, I think. You know, you tiptoe in and then you quickly get involved.
I keep finding this way, and I'm going to date myself this way, but I keep finding ways to invoke this slogan from a TV show called Candid Camera, and it had this sort of like theme song jingle sort of thing, and the tagline was sort of like, when you least expect it, you're elected. And once, that's the thing, is like, it's very difficult and opaque as to how to get involved with the party initially, but once you do, God help you. Like once you're in, you'll be turning down, they're calling me to join the executive and calling me to do this and that. But anyway, so I worked with Tammy Jakin for a long time, and I also have been working with someone named Rana Zaman for a while too on these rallies. And Rana was a federal candidate, and she was booted from her federal candidacy after handily winning a contested nomination in which she clearly brought out tons of her community. She won the contest, and then the party capitulated to CEJA, as they've done so many times. And CEJA, of course, has its local affiliate here at the Atlantic Jewish Council, and they're affiliated with many such councils across the country. And so they objected to specifically a post of Rana's which criticized Israel's actions during the Great March of Return, criticizing them for, having their snipers murder medics and maim children and doing, all the sorts of things that they documentedly did. And CEJA, of course, objected to that, and the party ended Rana's candidacy rather quickly after that. And I felt this was one of the most embarrassing things. And Jessa, I know that you've had lots of opportunity for embarrassment at the hands of the NDP, but this was still, I think, in more ways, being at the subsequent nomination meeting where the losing candidate was acclaimed anyway. Votes were taken and discarded, but then their membership money was taken and kept. And there are Muslims out front of our nomination meeting protesting it.
Surely not just Muslims.
Justifiably. Having worked with Rana made me familiar with the regularity with which the NDP ends candidacies over those candidates' support for Palestine. You think of Paul Manley, who won the second Green Party seat ever after the Fed Party ended his candidacy, again on thin allegations of anti-Semitism. And so they've demonstrated not merely that they're willing to bow down, they're willing to lose seats over it, and have lost at least one seat over it.
But this isn't what caused you to leave the party, is it?
This is leading up to it, because I had a great sensitivity to this exact issue. Like, this was, and that's why I want to underscore, like, when the NS NDP sort of, on behalf of CEJA, bullied Tammy into ending her candidacy, this was the one line the party couldn't cross, with the one person they couldn't cross it with me. And especially with me having this enhanced knowledge of, like, the party has this history of chucking people because of their support for Palestine. This was the reason pretty much that I stopped considering offering for the NDP, that I stopped considering running, is that, like, they have demonstrated they're cowards on this issue. And I don't think that, like, my greatest risk in running for the NDP is the NDP. That's the threat. And after a year of, all the things we're seeing on our phones, the absolute, like, stuff that only first responders see, like, some horrifying things, after seeing a year of that, and after having to call the leader of the party to account in provincial council, after having done all those things, they did just the worst possible thing they could have done. And this is one of the reasons why my decision to leave was nearly instant once I read the party's message and their sort of throwing of Tammy under the bus. So to run you through the events of it briefly, from my perspective, I guess, I got a call on, like, the Saturday of the second weekend of the election. It was from the chief of staff of the party, James Pratt, with which you might have some familiarity because you knew he was involved the second I mentioned it happened.
I have many little birdies. I'll just tell you that. Many little birdies.
You immediately responded, James Pratt. I was like, I didn't say anything about James Pratt, neither the article I just sent
Like
you.
whenever the party fucks up, I my DMs are just absolutely full with what happened.
Totally, I bet they are. So this is what happened. They called me and they said, and like what they said to me is basically what they did. They sort of told her that CJ was going to make her life miserable, that her candidacy would only get worse, and it was kind of a like, we'll allow you to continue, but you're doomed if you do. They called me to tell me that she had elected to end her candidacy, and I think the reason they did this is that they knew that I would walk.
Damage control or attempted.
Yeah, they were. He was like, this is the thing. Like this James guy really think like what the way he put it to me was that there's no local regional legacy media on politics in Nova Scotia on a long weekend. So we're going to do it now. We're going to try and wait out the weekend, keep our heads down, and hope it goes away. These don't take the weekend off. Cell phones and social media accounts don't take the weekend off, unfortunately, and so that's something they didn't consider in their strategy, and I think it might have come back to bite them a little bit. And I think I was part of that. They called me to to try and feign concern for Tammy too, which is one of the really galling things about this is they're making it as if they're protecting her when people write to them. The party has been responding first by feigning concern for Tammy and then validating the smear against her that CJ has made, which is that it's a conflation to talk about. And this was the week everyone learned the word conflation, apparently, because I keep hearing it all of a sudden. That it's a conflation to say that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, effectively. You can't, because Tammy quote tweeted the Auschwitz memorial and said something about the genocide happening in Gaza right now, and that's what the party is saying is a conflation, quote unquote, and it's not. But in addition to capitulating to what they have told me is a bunch of bullying, because James is on his phone call to me told me, oh, CJ is so awful and their tactics are just bullying, and it's such a shame.
What a bunch of cowards.
Oh, I think that is part of it for sure. I do think that people have talked about, oh, Zionists have infiltrated the party, and like there is the odd Zionist in that party, like, and I've met them and had like discussions about their annoying centrist political beliefs in the comment sections of my TikToks, but ultimately this is tactical cowardice and incompetence to an extent, and I think that is going to be borne out. I think it's going to be borne out that it did them more damage to capitulate than to stand up to what is effectively a third party lobby group acting in the interest of a foreign country. This is the thing, like the whole, like you might want to say, and provincial politicians might want to say that Palestine's not a provincial political issue, but what is of issue, I think, to Canadians right now nationally is foreign interference in our electoral process. And that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing an organization with another nation's name in its name bullying our politicians into pulling candidates. And I think that we should be seeing this at least partially through a lens of foreign interference in our electoral politics, because that's exactly what's happening.
Whether, I don't even care where it comes from, it's based on upholding a genocide and an illegal occupation. Canadian politicians, I mean, some of the NDP might be an exception, but this is the Canadian project as well, right? We are colonial occupation. We operated much in the same way. We committed a genocide that we don't want people talking about, and we sure as hell don't want them attributing it to the Canadian state. We like to pass that on to the English as though we had nothing to do with it. But yeah, I think like one of the strategical downfalls that you're hinting at and kind of demonstrated through what you just told us is folks can see the polls and they can see the Liberals slipping and they can see a couple of good ads they might like by the NDP. But all in all, this kind of behavior that you've seen that Sean has described in just Nova Scotia, we have seen in Ontario, we have seen in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. We have testaments from all of those places of them behaving like this and the repercussions. Now, sure, most of the public doesn't give a shit about the Eastern Passage candidate for NDP. Like, let's be honest. We love Tammy. You know her. We don't think it's right, and as part of like the progressive family, we care. But the NDP sees like it won't carry any political damage from this. But they completely rely on the labor of people who are sold on them as a mechanism for change. The people that do labor for them believe their voice should matter within the party and, for the most part, have immovable values. And they're just breaking all of these pressure points. Like for you, it was someone close to you. For other people, it's a certain issue they won't hit on. Their failure to get behind disabled people, and there's tons of examples of them being vindictive against autistic members and candidates, trying to remove them for their advocacy against ABA. Like, that's a shout out to Joel Harden, who many people admire and think he is a form of positive change. But even he admittedly behaved in this very way, didn't like what people had to say and thought to remove them from the party. You're losing all of this labor, even if you're just talking about like the signs and all the work Sean does alone for the very small province of Nova Scotia, whose resources within that party are so depleted, some would describe as the party doesn't really exist there. I mean, from other provinces, if you looked at the activity that, Ontario and some other provinces have, it's shocking when you talk to how many people are actually active within the East Coast provinces for the NDP. So the labor, it's not normal for someone to do signs for 10 ridings. My point is that once they go into this federal election or even a provincial election, they need the same people they've burned to do a lot of the legwork. Young people come in finding their way in politics. I just talked to a new patron of ours who's just, again, finding their way in politics and thinking perhaps their first step would be to contact their local NDP riding association. You can only imagine what my advice was. However, I do say people sometimes have to go into this system, see it, so they can fully understand how electoral politics actually works, so that when you need to apply pressure, you don't waste your time in certain positions. But the damage that they're doing through acts like this that they don't really sit and think about. Like, they're just concerned of like, will Nova Scotia media pick this up and blow this out? And what will that mean? And they try to do calculations, and really none of them seem to involve like, what will this do to our base?
Like, there's the whole like, don't attribute to malfeasance what can be explained by incompetence sort of argument, where like, yeah, no, they've grossly miscalculated. This is the thing, is like, not only are these people venal and amoral, they're bad at their jobs. So James Pratt, and you're probably better qualified to offer a background on James Pratt than I am, but my understanding is that he was Jack Layton's campaign manager or something to that effect. He's also the person who gave Matthew Wheeldon, who was a federal candidate elsewhere in Nova Scotia a few elections back, gave him half an hour to rescind his candidacy, or it was going to be rescinded for him for the same reasons. There are young folks coming into the party. Like, there's that joke about, I've seen this meme go around of, there's like an e-girl and like a really old man asleep and sitting in his seat like next to each other on the bus, and it's described as like, this is what every NDP EDA meeting looks like. It's
Oh
like,
no.
like
Oh no.
very, 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 very young people, and then very old people. A lot of whom want the same things. Actually, I think people sometimes think that like, oh, there's too many old people in the party, and that's the problem. It's like, if anything, there's too many of my generation in the party. There's too many Gen Xers, like Gen X centrists, where you have like the old folks who joined the party 20 years ago, who joined an explicitly socialist party and absolutely want those policies, and the young people who want socialist policies now and think that's the party they've joined, not realizing that Thomas Mulcair has gotten in and mucked with the Constitution and all these things, and that it's been watered down, and it's nearly ideologically identical to the Liberals. Federally, and I think in Nova Scotia too. I'm hearing from candidates that say our campaign lost all momentum after that happened. I'm hearing people saying that like, supporters are ripping their signs out of their lawns, they're retracting their offers to donate, they're retracting their offers to volunteer, and they're now saying, I don't know who to vote for. So it's an election issue now.
Yeah, let's hit on why it bothered so many people this time. Because, I mean, surely over in Nova Scotia, you folks aren't in some sort of bubble. You've seen what the Ontario NDP has done to Sarah Jama and how they just generally behaved with the Israeli lobby. Uh, I don't know if you folks are all over there satisfied that Heather McPherson is wearing a pin and standing up and hollering once in a while in the legislature, but uh, they have been far from champions for Palestine and have kicked countless people out of the party. I mean, I'm included in that. we can't remove ourselves from the fact that we're in a different time now. Like when we're talking about Palestine, you talked about a candidate getting removed in 2018, right? Well, the March of Return was in 2018, early 2019. So, people's knee-jerk reaction to seeing someone removed over Palestine would not hit the same as it does now, right?
True, absolutely.
Because it's hard to imagine anybody who's seen what we've seen for the last year and still not doing everything possible, including defending candidates who are being demonized by CJA, uh, even as they acknowledge how awful CJA is. Right. So to not have that courage in this moment is unquestionable. Like we don't understand it. And we are finding courage where we maybe never had it before.
And I think that the Heather McPherson thing and the like Matthew Green in the House of Commons with their the keffiyehs or watermelon pins or whatever. Hearing the leader recite CJA talking points when he's asked about Palestine, and he starts talking about scared Jews in Montreal when he's not been asked about that, and he's pivoting to all the same talking points he's been fed by this organization. It really just makes Matthew Green's efforts look like Nancy Pelosi and Kente Cloth.
Yes, people need to understand Heather and Matthew are just tokens to make sure that they capture folks so that anybody that is on the fence that just needs something, anything to hold on to in electoral politics can say, well, the NDP at least are standing up and saying X, Y, and Z. They are starting petitions where nobody else is doing anything. I mean, I talked to somebody who was really thrilled about their mayor in Mississauga and how awesome they were. And I'm like, we're ready to throw a fucking parade because somebody's trying to uphold the charter. Like someone's doing the bare fucking minimum and we're like, oh, thank you so much. Like I will forget all the other things that you've ever done because there's just like one little glimmer of hope there. So I want to ask folks, like I want to ask you, but I think there's a lot of people out there listening that are in the same boat. And I saw them do horrible things, prop up John Horgan while he sicked the RCMP on land offenders and was just clearing old growth. And brought him into federal convention at that very year when there was a petition against him, like no distancing of that awfulness. And so many people walked from the party then. I stayed. I stayed because I thought I could change the party, right? And I stayed with a lot of other comrades who thought the same thing. But then, it was, eventually they kicked me out for trying to change the party. But many, many people dropped out. There were trigger points for everyone. Sarah Jama was a big trigger point again. And then Nova Scotia now has had its own trigger point. But from your perspective, why did you stay after they gave you so many reasons to leave?
I ultimately I did think that I could at least exert some leverage. I don't know if I thought that I could fundamentally change the party. There was an inflection point after having been involved for a long time and involved, especially in a lot of like central activities and around the governance. You were probably out by the time the 2021 federal convention happened, but it was a technical debacle in addition to being a procedural and more.
No, I think I ran as federal president there.
Oh, really? Was that the one?
I'm pretty sure that's the year I ran for
against
party president.
His first name starts with a D, last name was Coley, Koh.
Yeah, DJ. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was my opponent. We got 30% of the vote with the 2-week campaign.
And was that the one where they very, very obviously filibustered the Palestine bill?
Yes.
Like nakedly so. In fact, like I would argue they did it in a way that made it clear that someone had their finger on the scale procedurally because
the chair has an earpiece the entire time. And whenever there's conflict, sits and waits and listens for instructions. Folks who miss that, this was the filibuster of all time. Just very quickly, it was so bad that they'd stretched the discussion prior to that. It was something to do with a situation in India. I'm not even going to pretend to have all the details for whatever that was. And it got to the point where people rebutting revisions, what do you call them? Amendments. Sorry. People who were rebutting amendments had written talking points.
Yeah.
So they had anticipated the suggested amendment and they had written already 3 minutes of talking points to refute that, and this went back and forth, whereas any other issue you would have had somebody be able to get to the mic and call the question saying, we've talked about this enough, let's call the question, we don't have all day to spend on this. That never really happened with that particular motion, and it left like 2 minutes for the Palestinian question. So they really just didn't want any back and forth. They would allow people to read like the first statement and then they sent it to a vote. The reason I kind of went out on this, even though it's not really what we're talking about, because when people talk about reforming the NDP, we have like so many episodes dedicated to like the different mechanisms within the party and how they work. And convention is one of the most controlled spaces in the party, yet it holds the only key to accessing the levers of power within the party, the alleged levers of power, the democratic positions. Right. So they elect an executive council that is supposed to run the party. In the end, there's another episode that explains that it doesn't actually run the party anyway. So winning those elections doesn't really do much anyway, but they've done whatever possible to just completely control those spaces, which in the end controls the dialogue within the party, because that is the only space that members actually get into a same room with like all their counterparts and MPs and party brass and unions and discuss what it means to be an NDPer. Like, where are we going to stand on these very important issues? And it's only the most popular issues that get talked about. So even with in its legitimate design, the design that everyone smiles and nods and says, this sounds really democratic, everyone just votes on what we're even going to talk about. So only the most popular and agreed upon points even end up on the agenda in the first place. So, part of this episode isn't just hear Sean's story. It's also for me to kind of get out the many, many, many ways in which the NDP serves as like a very moderating force for us, as a space where we spin our wheels and de-radicalize. Not as individuals, but as effectiveness. Because you'll have real radicals still in there thinking, they're fighting for the abolishment of police and prisons and free transit, things that shouldn't be radical, but you know what I'm talking about. They're there, but they are not getting anywhere within that party. And if you look at the Palestinian cause as an example of this, decades were spent trying to get the party to take a half decent position on this. And not only were they like just unpopular at the time, right? Like, you just couldn't get members to come along, and that work had to be done, and it took a long time, and maybe it took exposing of the Israeli state a little bit more unmasking to get people along. But in the end, we found out that wasn't the case. We know that it was just thwarting by party brass for years and years, since the years of Jack Layton, and they've only gotten better at it, suppressing the Palestinian question, so to speak, all across in every way imaginable. And that is just one issue that, even once you thought there was a glimmer of hope, even when people started to celebrate the fact that they finally took a decent position on where they stood with Israel, I don't remember the language that was finally adopted, but in practice it meant nothing but a watermelon pin, the calling for a ceasefire without the celebration of Palestinian resistance whatsoever.
This touches on nearly every organization, every institution, I think, nearly in existence in our society, is that there is this divide between the ostensible democratic governance of that institution and the staff layer of that institution, and the relationship between those two things, and the way that we seek to check the power of one over the other. And I think that convention's a great example. We labor over these policy positions, and we research them, and we debate them, and we pass them. They go into a policy book, and that policy book goes on a shelf.
It might as well go in the shredder.
And what people think that they're doing when they do that is that they think that they're instructing caucus what to do. But they're not. They're instructing the party, which is a separate entity, to ask caucus to do something. And that's the most leverage you'll ever get over caucus, and it doesn't really mean anything. And there was a motion that was passed after convention at one of our provincial councils in Nova Scotia, asking that the party provide regular reports as to how each of the policy positions in our policy book that is now constituted of all these resolutions people have made. They asked them for regular reporting as to progress on each of those. And all of the caucus people and staff people all objected to it. They're going to do their, like, whatever PricewaterhouseCoopers campaign they delivered this time, whatever platform is what's going to come out. And they did a big platform consultation to manufacture consent, but none of it means anything. I was at those consultations. I heard the things that people were asking for, and none of them are in the platform. No one's asking for a gas tax holiday during a climate crisis. No one's asking for you to lock in a 2.5% rent increase for landlords who rapaciously increased their rents as much as they possibly could when people were at their most desperate. All kinds of awesome things the people in the party wanted, and the mechanism that is put in front of them to ostensibly provide that is a sham.
Yeah, I'll link folks to another episode that where we walk through the many mechanisms and actually the very deliberate choices made under Jack Layton to remove the power of the policy book from the platform or private members' bills or any possibility of like tangible work on those issues. I am going to be devil's advocate for just a second. Well, I've had many people, come back at me for, all the things that we're saying right now, obviously. I'm sure you have too. And one of the things that I have learned to hate most, and you use this word, so this is also a mini attack on you. So just
Okay, come at me.
is they would argue that by behaving the way that they are doing in the current political climate, whatever that means, they're being pragmatic. They are going after maybe low-hanging fruit, whatever they can get. Be realistic, Sean. We're not going to get that in Nova Scotia. So they are doing what they think is possible within the systems available to them. And surely you can relate, right? And we've all been there. Like I have been completely open into my many years of trying to use the mechanisms within the party and elsewhere. That's one of my points there on how they moderate us is by forcing that pragmatic approach or selling that as the most reasonable way forward. There was a speech I heard just today. It was about pragmatism. And so when you said that word, I wrote it down and underlined it. And I was like, I've got to go back to that speech. So I'm going to play it here and then we'll react together because it's a struggle that everyone has, right? When we're talking about electoral politics being the kind of pragmatic approach, we can't abandon it. And anyway.
I hope we can look around at everyone who's gathered here on the streets instead of in that room up there. Look at the hundreds of people who are gathered elsewhere in Winnipeg, in Vancouver, in Halifax, in Fredericton, and know that we're reading these same words, that we are orienting to the same horizon of Palestinian liberation, and know that another kind of literary world, one that doesn't traffic in blood money and self-interest, but in solidarity and collective power already exists, because we the people have made it so. This year, the Giller closed its gala doors on everyone but literary and corporate elites, so we brought our counter gala to their door and to the streets. We fielded a lot of critiques in bad faith from people like the ones who are in that room across the street at the Giller Gala since this campaign started. Literary elites who have said criticized us for expanding our targets to include Indigo Books and the Israeli Foundation, for not trying to make slow institutional change from the inside of the sector, for not trying to find a third way, a more quote-unquote pragmatic way. And to that, I want to share the words of the political theorist Joy James, who writes, "If you're going to use the word pragmatic to discipline radicals, my preference is that you say nothing at all. If you want to discipline rebels, then pony up something tangible, raise bail funds, pay for their attorneys, feed their kids while they're inside, or try to get them out. You cannot lecture risk-taking people about being politically infantile out of your fear, out of your own accumulations. There's nobody we admire who is pragmatic. Everybody could have been pragmatic, but if they were, we would not have any ancestors." So I want to do away with this false binary between writers and organizers. Culture alone, the work we do on the page, will not be enough. Reasoning with, trying to reform the cultural institutions that prop up this state will not be enough. We have to be willing, at the very least, to take risks for each other, to relinquish the false accolades, the fancy galas, all of them the oppressors' incentives to keep us from actively building solidarity with each other.
Rated E for everyone.
I'll leave that in, but that definitely is rated for everyone. Okay, let me just talk about that for a second, and then I'm going to go to you, okay, Sean? Because I'm sure you heard it, but I'm going to draw the parallels to the NDP there. What you heard there was a member of the Writers Against the War on Gaza. We had them on to talk about their resistance to the Giller Prize that is funded by Scotiabank. And as you've heard, they've expanded their horizons. They've also included tactics that would definitely not be described as pragmatic. And when she speaks of, another world, she's encouraging authors to see beyond the structures created by Scotiabank and the Giller Prize, because it's not just a gala, right? It's readings and it's an economy of its own within that particular sector. And that's what keeps people scared of butting up against it, because they feel like that would eat into their bottom line or their possibility of exposure or getting their word out, being heard, right? The writers having their voice silenced. And she's encouraging them, there is already other systems there. We are demonstrating this to you. You don't have to be in those galas. You don't have to be in those rooms to affect change. And this wasn't to say, you hear her scolding perhaps people who would lecture radicals, right? That's not to say that's what Sean was doing. But we definitely do get lectured on being pragmatic within the NDP. That is something, as soon as you try to reform it from within, you will have longtime members come to you and maybe they'll say, there's no point. You're not the first person to do this. Use what's there. This is what's possible within this realm. I've got an inside line with Merritt. I'm going to sit down and talk to Merritt about the wrongdoings her party is doing. And I will come back to you folks and tell you what she said. Backdoor solutions, right, that remain open to just a few. So the NDP parallel there to the speech you just heard is also the maintaining of legitimacy through using elites. And that doesn't mean financial elites within the party, but I mean insiders, people with friends in the party, with connections, with the ability to maybe be heard once in a while. And they really close out to everybody else. They're still able to maintain, but they lean heavily on those insiders and that kind of exclusivity. So after hearing that, and talking about trying to remain in the party and be as pragmatic as possible, and there are still mechanisms in there, surely influence can be wielded. Like, how do you feel about all that now?
Well, it's funny, and one thing I really had to acknowledge from that speech is the use of the term third way, because this is obviously a term that we've certainly heard before in the NDP. And, where we're talking about the Leighton era, I don't know if a lot of people share this view of mine, but in my view, Leighton was the beginning of the end of a meaningful left in the NDP. I think that was in the same way that, like, when I'm door knocking and the people who hate poor people and drug addicts the most are the people who got just a little taste. They maybe got me like a side-by-side in their driveway, or they got like a nice, like a little boat, or like a skidoo, or maybe a nice truck. And like when I was going to the door with free ambulance rides on the platform last time provincially, we offered we're gonna waive ambulance fees.
So radical,
right? And people were furious. The junkies are going to be using that as a taxi service, and our hospital's in like an industrial park in Dartmouth. And when the NDP got a little taste of proximity to power with the electoral result they got from the Jack Layton campaign, that was it. And they were all in on orange liberalism and getting outflanked by the Liberals on the left, campaign after campaign. Hearing the third way invoked with the word pragmatism in the same sentence, it really causes you to think of like, this is like, you can easily see like this is how we got here in a lot of ways. And there's definitely an argument to be made for that. I think that in terms of what I did in the party, I feel relatively good. Like, I was the only person to speak up at a number of junctures, the only person to try and hold power to account when no one else really did, in front of like an audience of their peers, like in provincial council, like having the Rules and Privileges Committee hauled in front of provincial council to explain a decision they had made, a disciplinary decision where they protected someone who was transphobic.
I remember
when the leader got up in the legislature and said, I condemn Hamas, bad things are bad, blah, 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 said nothing about Israel when Israel's already well into its carpet bombing campaign. Because she had said, targeted attacks on civilians and children are never acceptable. And so the question I put to her after a brief intro was, will you now condemn the state of Israel for their targeted attacks on women and children? And what happened, Her answer was almost immaterial because what happened immediately then was the entire room erupted in applause. And that's not really a thing that happens at provincial council meetings. You know what I mean? Like, it's a business meeting. You go through every line of the budget. You know, you're just rubber stamping things. It's procedural stuff, right? So it's not a rah thing for the most part. And so in establishing that and in building the social capital it took to get that to happen, to get people to listen to me, because like they eventually over time, after I've been involved for 7 years, people in the party will hear me out. When I get on that microphone, which is not very often, but when I do, they listen. And for me to have the opportunity to be in the room and to demonstrate to the leadership that they're out of step with the membership on this issue and they need to change course, I wouldn't have been in that position if I hadn't stayed as long as I did. So like, what did it accomplish? I don't know.
You knew that would be my question.
You can't argue in favor of pragmatism and not have any results to show for it, right? This is the thing. You can't, if you're gonna lay claim to pragmatism, you have to produce some results. And I don't know if it did with the leadership, but leaders can be replaced.
If we finally get a leadership race anywhere, I mean, that thing seems to have gone by the wayside for the party too.
Well, yeah, because the knives don't come out, I don't think, quickly enough in this party. When leaders lose, we expect to lose. And this is the thing about like this sort of like third way centrist approach the party is taking, is that the proposition used to be adhere to your values and you'll probably lose. But now the proposition is surrender your values and lose anyway. And it's a fundamentally unattractive proposition. And that's what kind of like, you know, there's just like, if that's the proposition, like why am I even doing this? Like, you know, like publicly sell out my values and then pick up like 5 seats. You know, there's just like the cost benefit doesn't work. But in terms of like what I did in the party and what I did with my time in the party and the way that I left the party, even, I didn't just like, okay, well, I'm done. Like, I tried to make it count. I tried to, because I felt like I had an opportunity in leaving, and in doing so publicly and in naming names, I felt that I had an opportunity, hopefully, to shift the perception of this sort of like standard operating procedure of just capitulating to CJ. They're making the calculus that it will be easier to capitulate, and we need to change that. And I thought I had an opportunity to change that, and I took it. I don't know that anyone else really did anything of that level. I don't think anyone else necessarily like walked away. So like, I don't know, like that's kind of how I feel about my time. I can't tell you that it's worth, for everything I put in. I don't think I can sit here and tell you that that's something that I think everyone should do. I think you should go and invest a bunch of years in a party that like is probably doomed and then throw a big flipper when you quit. And that wasn't my end goal. I really did aspire to exert internal influence on the party. And it's, whether we like it or not, electoralism is how power is decided in our society.
For now.
For the most part. Like, we talk about people party a lot and we have a lot of demonstrations and we do some direct actions and whatever, but that's how power by and large is decided in our society. And I don't feel like, as a person of relative privilege, I don't feel like I can just kind of like walk away from that. I feel obliged to engage with it somehow, in some way that hopefully has some kind of positive objective.
Okay, I'm going to push back on that. Definitely it's how we select representation, but I would argue it's not how power is decided. You've just explained very much so that, you know, CJA wielded a lot more power than the entire provincial council, or, you know, generally if you polled people living here, people living in Nova Scotia, on how they felt about the genocide in Israel, that's not what's influencing them. So powerful decisions are being made by capital interest, it seems. Right, we could say foreign, but again, we've a million times over boiled this down to imperialism and the interests of U.S. interests and capital interests, and that's really what the genocide in Gaza is about in the end. So I wouldn't say we are abandoning electoralism. We're definitely abandoning partisanship, because that's really got us nowhere, because we're not abandoning electoralism, because in essence, we already have. If you look at the NDP even as like the most progressive option, we elect landlords, lawyers. We put advisors in charge, corporate advisors, you know, lobbyists that also work for Metro, groceries, Airbnb, big oil and gas. In essence, by propping up a party like the NDP, you are abandoning it to the capitalist class still. it's our behavior within this electoral system and this representative democracy and the way that we view the best of us, right? Who should go represent the best of us. And we have seemingly collectively decided that it's the richest amongst us. I mean, the system also requires money, but even when we do a lot to mitigate that, we still are looking to elites to lead us. We are still selecting them from amongst other choices, and for the most part. And so in the end, although we've done all these contests, we've sent the same class off to make decisions against our best interests.
Part of it goes back to the professionalization of the party that began under Leighton. It's one of the reasons I say that he's sort of the beginning of the end. Like I see it through the lens of like a lot of businessy language. Like what we're doing is moving forward on a go forward basis with best practices. Like that's what they're doing.
Even the way they refer to members, you're like paying units now.
Oh yeah, no, it's a business like this, and that's how I think how some of the staffers see it, because it's their job to an extent. Like I think that, and there is an extent to which I think that we see the class interests of the consultant class represented in platform, because that's who it's actually coming from. I don't think it's not meaningfully coming from the membership. I think they tried to obtain consent from the membership to do something when they did platform consultations this time, which were new, but I don't think I don't see a line between what was said in those meetings and what made it its way into the platform. I think it was all, PricewaterhouseCoopered and Deloitted to death. If I had realized like who they had gotten themselves in bed with, because he's a new hire, right? He was only hired, I think, in the last year when somebody went on mat leave.
He goes around. He works his way around.
Yeah. So I mean, once I started finding out about him, I was like, oh, here we go. We caught Fed Party disease. We caught we caught the contagion of the Federal Party with.
Well, we passed our awful provincial director on to the Federal Party, so it's all polluted.
Right, like this is the Anne McGrath thing, or Lucy Watson, one of those.
Lucy Watson.
Yeah, Lucy Watson became the federal director, like the notorious, and watching, I've been basically checked out of the Federal Party since 2021 when Jagmeet Singh had a big, like, everyone, here's John Horgan, he's really great and awesome, and the next day he announced that he was going to go ahead with the Site C Dam. And that was when I called the Federal Party and had them cancel my PAC. But yeah, I at the time was like, based on the way the membership felt in the meetings, and based on some conversations I'd had in private with some of the caucus, I had hoped that there was some runway for them to take a morally appropriate position on this, and that they would show some leadership, and they just didn't. And it's like, I feel let down. And again, because we talk about resources and who's provided resources. When I agreed to do the signs for the party, they agreed to provide me a number of things they did not provide. And so because I needed those things, namely volunteers, I had to very publicly on my Instagram just basically become like Captain NDP, and I've got my hat on and I'm showing all the tools that I use, and I'm showing all the signs that I'm putting up, and I'm like, come join the NDP sign army. And I've recruited 20 of my own volunteers. I had to so publicly advocate for the party to get the resources that I needed that when they publicly did this, they left me no choice. And that's one thing that was probably lost on them, is like I've very publicly been the only two things on my Instagram page are Palestine and the NDP, basically. And like, you've put me in the position where one of them has to go, because they're mutually exclusive at this point, because of the cowardice they've shown and because of the way that they continue to smear this candidate. Yeah, I mean, at that point, for me, the pragmatic thing to do, I guess, was to, I need to create political accountability for what's happening. There needs to be something scarier than CIJA.
I keep thinking back to the discussion I had with Dimitri Lascaris, the most recent one. And I wanted to ask him about how he felt about international law now, because, I mean, even months into the genocide and various ICJ, ICC rulings, nothing had moved, Canadian-wise. Globally is another discussion as well. But even after more rulings and more findings, we've revisited the discussion. And at first he really thought, there was a certain amount of pressure that the international community would be able to provide to Canadian politicians that would essentially force their hands. Like, how long could you act in contravention of all of these statutes you've signed on to, and, your obligations to the international community? And, even if they didn't want to come along, they would have to, if you could be successful in that realm. And although obviously we've seen arrest warrants now issued for Benjamin Netanyahu and others, and Trudeau promising he would arrest Netanyahu should he set foot on Canadian soil. Dimitri kind of, when he revisited it, he looked back, and what he said was that he had underestimated, I believe he used the word callousness of our politicians. They're, even here, we espouse the theory of change that, enough public pressure in various forms all together will make politicians move. They have to, right? They want to get reelected. But this has bucked that trend completely. We have to reevaluate our electoral systems when no amount of street protests, petitions, inner disagreements within parties, bad press, international rulings, deaths, evidence, none of that has moved even the most progressive politicians in Canada. I think we have underestimated our ability to influence people within that electoral system. I think they have set themselves up for so closely now. Even our working class party, this professionalism Sean talks about, includes the ability to people who work within the party to get hired after, to be appealing to capital after, right? And so they're not listening to us at all anymore. At all. They are only listening to capital. And so when I'm scratching my head to think of something scarier than CEJA, and I don't think people like my answer, because it's not even just people in the streets. Like, if you just took as many people into the streets as possible, just directed at the NDP saying, fuck you, hold the line, hold a goddamn ideological line, and you got every NDP member to call, email, I don't know if you'd move them. We don't know anymore. This threshold is unimaginable at this point, because I would have thought turning on your Instagram account for like 5 minutes would be enough to get you to refuse to participate in the next fucking House meeting unless Canada stops sending arms to Israel. When you do that, Sean quit because his friend got removed from a candidacy, but our politicians in there are sitting on their asses talking about a GST holiday for 2 months, bragging about it, and haven't done sweet fuck all for Palestine, for a litany of other issues that people will cry about at convention, that are like so deeply personal and systemic and need addressing, and they've just ignored it because it's just not in their interest. And the NDP base is some of the worst. You want to know why? Not because they're bad people at all. These are my comrades. I love probably most of them. The ones that don't, they know who they are. But these are good people. But these are good people between a rock and a hard place. These are people who don't have, like, if you're a conservative and you just think, Pierre Poilievre is just a piece of shit and he's just not for you, you could probably hold your breath and vote Liberal, not see, materially, you won't really see much of a difference, especially if you're in the majority here.
Especially if you're in Nova Scotia, because this is one problem we have in Nova Scotia, is that there is so little daylight between the three political parties. For example, the ostensible Conservative government right now just burned through 2 consecutive billion-dollar budget surpluses in 22 and 23, and then in 24 posted a deficit budget. What's conservative about that? There's not, like, this is, like, the thing is, the Conservatives aren't meaningfully conservative. The ostensibly leftist NDP aren't left. Like, they're all offering some kind of tax breaks when we're running a deficit. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't. There's no, like, this is the thing. Like, when we, like, I've been on the doorstep a bunch now, although I try to stay away from it because there's other places I can be more useful. And what people say over and over again is when the NDP were in power here, because there was an NDP government under Darrell Dexter here in Nova Scotia more than a decade ago. Because we're just like the rest of them, and they're not wrong. And this is the thing, is that people don't come to the NDP when they want the status quo. They come to the NDP when they want change. So it's not good enough, and it'll never be good enough for New Democrats to try and be a better researched Liberal Party, which is sort of what they are. Like, it's a Liberal Party that wants to have an abortion clinic in Cape Breton now. Like, or a Liberal Party that proclaims like an endometriosis awareness day. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't, like, those little incremental improvements are not going to be, and it's part of this, again, it's the whole business as usual thing. Like, when you tell electoralists who are not voting, you just disappear in a puff of smoke to them. You know what I mean? So, like, there's 50% of this province, because that's roughly what our election turnout rates are at right now is about 50%. In my own riding, it was 38% in the last provincial election of people who bothered voting. There's a whole political party, there's a whole supermajority of people out there, like a majority of the potential electoral vote, who want nothing to do with anything on offer, who don't want politics as usual.
I'm with them. I'm one of those people.
That's where I'm at now too. Like, I don't like business as usual isn't going to cut it, and not even from, dare I say it, a pragmatic standpoint. This is the thing: is like you can lay claim to pragmatism, as I have done, but you have to show results, or it's a hollow claim. You know what I mean? You have to show that you've done something that couldn't have been done otherwise.
It's also sometimes to legitimize your work too. Like the system forces you. Did you check those boxes? Did you try everything legitimate first? Because then I'll authorize you to step it up. Then you can look to a third way when you've proven. But here, like, we try to advocate for people to just try those third ways first. Because in the end, they end up, you have to apply, like Sean said, so you have NDP in power, you got Liberals, Conservatives, whoever they are, you still have to go at them from the same way once they're in power, right? You still have to approach them from whatever kind of way, whether it be pragmatic or radical, and to get stuff done. But before we wrap up, I do want to make one more point about the NDP base, again, who, like, I'm not trying to demonize this. The point of this is to demonstrate just how they do moderate us, like how they pull us in with these promises and their theories of change that they pretend to advocate for. And they sometimes use the language we need to hear, but when it really counts, when they're talking outward, right, when they're talking to the public, they actually use the language of capital and the right wing quite a lot, means testing and everything except a GST. My point is the base there becomes the most ineffective base also because they often refuse to hold the powerful to account. For the same reason they don't leave the party is because they're afraid of the alternatives. They aren't going to go to the Liberal Party or the Conservatives, so they don't want to burn down the NDP. Even most people who leave don't leave like Sean. They just quietly take their memberships away so that they can balance internally, with their morals. Then they know that they're not actually financially contributing to this. They might get their vote. They might hold their nose and vote because, again, they don't want to vote Liberal and they don't want to vote Conservative, and there's no good independents on the ballot, perhaps. Whatever. But they are so cowardly within the system for the most part, and I have been in there. I don't care how many examples of people you can give me, like Sean or myself. There are many that were very vocal all the time. I mean, there's some of us that enter spaces like that, and there's nothing we can do but rail against it. I'm talking mostly to my neurodivergent comrades. Like, you will smell it right away. The authoritarianism, you'll get the tingles right away, and you will fight back. I know you will, but you will be alone for the most part. Sean was not followed by a flood of people saying they had also ripped up their membership or made a stitch video saying, "Me too." The other ridings and candidates, they may have lost momentum, but they didn't issue statements. They also did not stand behind her. Tammy is probably feeling very, very alone right now. All these people that talked about a big progressive family are now trying to distance themselves from her as much as possible, even though privately they will express dismay and disappointment. Publicly, they won't say shit. Even in provincial council, it's very rare someone stands up and sticks their necks out and worries about whether or not they'll be asked to be a candidate or asked to work on this campaign or be a favorite, because it will come with a lot of slack. Because every time you talk shit about the NDP, online, in person, the response is, what do you want, the Conservatives to win? What do you want? You think the Liberals are better? It's like this really black and white dichotomy.
If you follow American politics, it's a familiar refrain, right? Like if you criticize,
of course,
Kamala Harris, you're a Trump supporter, right? And it's the same way. But in the same way that, like, this is the thing about these electoralists and their ostensibly expertise, is that I don't think they were paying attention to this most recent American election. Or they're listening to the pundits who are ignoring the elephant in the room, because none of these pundits will talk about the fact that 14 million people who voted for Joe Biden declined to vote for Kamala Harris. Like, there was no big shift of support from the Democrats to the Republicans. Both of them lost net voters. Just the Republicans lost fewer. They lost 3 million, whereas the Democrats lost 14 million. And so this is the thing. Like, And it's one of the things that worries me about trying to have, in doing what I did, in making it loud and messy and making it clear what happened, and being clear with the membership and with the people in my life who trust me and who trusted my trust of the party. Because, like I said, the pundits aren't getting it right. The people who are, you're looking to on the news, all the former party hacks who became public relations, heads of public relation firms or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's nearly all that describes basically every pundit that you'll see on CBC or CTV. They're all, I used to be in the party and now I'm with like Navigator or something, like, you know what I mean? Like that's the career path. And you're right to acknowledge that in terms of like, that's what some people are thinking about is like, where do I land from here? And that applies to politicians too. There's all kinds of politicians that are thinking about what kind of cushy private sector job am I going to land in once my term is over and once I've got my pension nailed down. But yeah, it does give me pause to think about, if they don't understand that like Palestine just cost them that election. Like that's the thing. Like, does it matter that Palestine cost them the election if they don't realize it and no one acknowledges it? I don't know. And I don't know if it like, that's what worries me. But this is like, yes, like I see a ton of people like withdrawing their support. It's not just the party faithful. It's voters are infuriated. Like they've been close to this issue. They were hoping for leadership on it from their party and they're being really disappointed and don't know who to vote for. So I do think that people are reacting. I think there are a lot of people in the base who are really mad and who are pushing back. But that's what concerns me is the sort of, it can be very difficult to convince somebody of something if their profession depends on them not understanding it, as has been said. So,
I mean, I think you wouldn't have to use the word. I think people are really pushing back because
my perception is they're pushing back because that's what I'm seeing on my, like in the just voluminous comments on my, because like a 30,000 view TikTok, like Nova Scotia provincial TikTok is not a thing. Like that's not a thing that happens. Like, so and
watching and resonating and understanding is one thing, but then taking the initiative to actually hold them accountable is another. So I think, yeah, a lot, what you're going to see is this quiet withdrawal of labor and volunteerism, this quiet withdrawal of people maybe thinking about being a candidate for them the next time. I know this has happened so many times over. I cannot believe people still sign up to be candidates. When my friends do it still, I try not to pass judgment, but obviously I am right now. But it's like, why are you expecting anything different? Because it's you? Because you know more people, because they wouldn't do that to you. My friends, they did it to Sarah Jama, and you need to see the numbers she won in Hamilton and the strength of support that the Ontario NDP gets in Hamilton and relies on in Hamilton, and they did not give a fuck. Not two shits. They did not relent at all.
Yeah.
Many people resigned from the Ontario NDP. Many people are volunteering now for Sarah Jama that would have put their labor into the NDP and refused to. But they still go online and brag about how their donations are up. And they did not issue any apology. They did not bring her back into the caucus. They didn't even humor the idea. They keep humiliating her by not standing next to her when she wore the keffiyeh or anything like that. And so it really goes just to my point here that it's like, you can do these things, and I'm happy you resigned, and I hope more people are pushing back. But if you're still going to give them donations and you're still going to just give them a vote and not try to hold them accountable in any way, they're going to keep repeating this behavior because it's working for them. I mean, if you're still funding a headquarters, then what prerogative do they have for change? Because their values aren't it.
Yeah, and this is the thing, is like it's this whole calculation they've made. And so like, yeah, by radically increasing the cost of participation, basically, like by driving out, like they're having to, like, instead of like, the week the campaign, the week the platform comes out, like instead of like they want to focus on the platform, but they're just getting annihilated in their inboxes about what happened with Tammy, because so many people have forwarded me their response. So that I know that there's a cost. I know that there is a political and logistic cost to what happened that would probably not have existed if I hadn't done what I did. So like, I don't know. I think there's all kinds of ways to have an effect inside and outside politics. I think that you are more powerful in the Nova Scotia NDP as a disaffected Liberal voter than you are as a loyal Democrat. Yeah, there's all kinds of ways to engage with the system. I think I feel a certain obligation. I think I've said this previously. Like I feel obliged to do something with the political system that I ostensibly, by virtue of demographics, have some kind of enhanced access to the levers of.
That is a fair assessment. I mean, you said it, I didn't. But I mean, when you spoke about being heard and felt like, you were listened to, your time in the party is one thing, but surely your demographics also help as being a white male inside the party. But in the end, if you push back hard enough, you're persona non grata, essentially, or you leave on your own accord.
That was sort of the only morally and morally tenable position for me, was to do what I did. Like, I made an honest try. I tried to push the needle. I think I got some people in the party thinking differently, and I got people in the party coming up and thinking differently to me. But in the end, like, can I make the leadership do things? No, it's true. And no, I tried to put all the information in front of them. I tried to even give the leader some runway, because I didn't name the leader when I made my videos.
Were you being pragmatic?
I was absolutely being pragmatic. I was trying, okay, well, let's give the leader a little bit of runway to get in front of this. And like, you can reverse course. And Halifax knows, this is the thing, is that this is a very, like, there's like South Shore for Ceasefire, and there's like an Antigonish for Gaza organization. But by and large, when you're talking about people who are organized on the issue of Palestine, you're talking about HRM, which is the base of power for the Nova Scotia NDP. Very, very urban party, as it is in so many other places. So this strikes right at the heart of their power. I don't know if it's changed their outcome, but I want them to come away from this realizing that they thinking that they miscalculated, or knowing they miscalculated, and that people want more about, from them. Their supporters want more from them on this issue. Maybe the Conservatives and Liberal supporters don't. But that's what the base wants, and there's going to be a lot of hardship if you show cowardice and capitulate to CJ.
Well, let's hope Jagmeet is watching. Surely Kamala learned this lesson the hard way, or maybe she didn't. Who knows? But thank you, Sean.
Thanks, Jess. I appreciate it.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content. And if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. So until next time, keep disrupting.